This session will be about race, media, and representation. The first one we have is class of 2020, which is Wilberto Secard, and his pronouns are he, him, his. Next, we have Giovanni Vargas from the class of 2021, pronouns are he, him, his. Next, we have from the class of 2022, Yami Jaquez, she, her, hers. Geraldine Martinez, she, her, hers. Dom Ocampo, she, her, hers. Adriana Perez Flores, they, them, theirs. And lastly, from the class of 2023, we have Gilia Heredia, she, her, hers. All right, so panelists, raise your hands if you feel accurately represented by the media. Okay, well, that looks about right. Very few of us do, and that's what we're here to talk about today. The first question to start this off is, can news outlets be neutral on topics about race?
At least in my opinion, I don't believe that news outlets can be neutral in the media when it comes to race. I think that they can try, but in doing so, usually that means to the benefit of the oppressor or to whatever party is taking advantage of or mistreating a minority in some way. And to remain neutral on topics of race in general, regardless of whether it's in the media or not, is, in my head, a way of almost invalidating the experiences of non-white folks. It's to say that their problems are something that you can treat almost as an academic exercise, and that picking either side doesn't have any real life consequences. So I personally think that's a really dangerous choice for news outlets to take.
I'm also kind of speaking on that. I'll try to keep this short, but I think race is inherently like not a neutral construct. Like it was invented to, have bias and to have like implicit, explicit bias. So it's kind of almost inherently impossible. And I think certain news channels do try to be neutral about it, like especially channels like CNN, but inherently, I don't think it's possible.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said. I think race is so salient that it's very difficult to just make it disappear when you're reporting. But I think also when you, as was mentioned earlier, when you do try to erase it, it often kind of ignores the experiences of people of color. So I don't think that media can be neutral. I also don't think it should be. I think instead it should strive to represent the experiences of people in a fair way, and not in like a biased sort of way.
And I think with everything that you've all said, you kind of touched upon this a little bit, but when you see a news headline, can you tell the race of the people in the story?
I think when it comes to inferring whether or not a certain title is for certain people, it can be done just due to the fact of how it's marketed, especially nowadays. Like, not everyone was with Black Lives Matter or other movements, and now all of a sudden everyone's with it because of marketing. So I think they do try their best to do that, actually, and encourage it.
I think on that note, a lot of news outlets right now also tend to note the race of the people involved in the story in the headline. And it's almost always when it's a person of color, even if it isn't really relevant to the story in the first place. And when I say not relevant, I mean like it isn't a matter of a hate crime or some sort of discriminatory activity. It's just like a way of reframing the people in the news outlet, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and kind of like spreading that bias. That's just what I've observed from headlines in mass media now.
Right. So in that sense, how does the media imply a racial category? And have you seen any examples portrayed in the media recently?
I think the media, and this isn't meant to be like every media outlet because it's hard to generalize, I think. But I think often you find that white people or people that are considered white, their race is just kind of the default. Like they don't talk about that person's race. Whereas when it's a person of color, like you'll usually get, whether they're Black or like Latinx or any, Asian. So I think that usually is a thing. I know that there was like a recent headline in the Lehigh Valley about a white man who shot at an employee at a cigar store and then engaged in a shootout with police officers. And it doesn't talk about his race at all. So although he's white, so it's just like, I think from that, you kind of can take that it's just white seems to be the default. We don't have to talk about it or say what he is if the person is white. But if it's a person of color, then we'll usually say what their racial background is.
I also notice that like the words associated usually when they do imply race, it's very interesting. Like when there's like, with the rise of school shootings, often like if the person was white who shot up the school, they're more attributed to having like mental illnesses, and there's more understanding with the media with what they've done versus like if it was someone who was Black, there's more like that like kind of like the words associated with that is like being violent aggressors or something. And the same with Latino and Latina.
Kilia, you mentioned these sort of associations. Why, this is for everyone, why do we have these unconscious associations?
Kind of going back to like what someone said earlier about how like race was meant, like it was constructed to be biased. And I think like over years it just kind of piled on. And, like now we're like to the point where it's like it's been passed down for so many generations that it's gotten to the point where it's unconscious. Like you just kind of do it by default.
Yeah, I think like definitely the news have a lot to do with it, since like everybody really sits down to the news because they need to know, what's going on in their cities or in their towns. So like the news is definitely like a big thing, but also like just like other types of media in general, newspapers, movies, like TV shows, like they all kind of follow the same thing, like, what I'm saying, like with the same biases.
I think to go off the same thing, a lot of the movies and books and media that we consume even as children, that industry is primarily run by white folks also. So we're not even getting stories that are written from people of color's perspectives in the first place, which makes it all the more easy to ingrain from a young age different stereotypes and implicit biases.
Yeah, so we've been hearing a lot about how Black and Latinx people are depicted in the news, but rarely do we see white American commits crime. Why do you think that is?
I think because especially in America, white is seen as the default. It's seen as normal. Like no one ever says white American. I feel like you never hear that term. It's always American. But for people like us, we're Latin American or Asian American. Like there's always going to be associations with people who are the other or who aren't white, even though more and more we're saying that's not actually the reality. Like white people aren't really the majority anymore. But yet I think it's kind of, again, with that same thing, like we've been programmed, this is the foundation of the country. White people are still the norm. So I think, again, especially like on the media, they're going to be depicted as normal. They're going to be what you see on TV. They're going to be what you see in the media. So it's not a surprise.
And also like the people that work in the media too. I mean, it's not very diverse. Like I'm a journalist major, and I could tell you that it's not diverse at all. Like this is like a place where we should have our own people telling our stories, but then we have these other people that don't even know like where we come from or what is really going on in our communities, telling these stories and telling them in the wrong way and using the wrong names for us, so that's really a big problem too. And the people, and like was mentioned earlier, the people that own these big news networks, they're white.
Right. And so we're noticing the trend of white people's race not being highlighted when they commit a crime. So why are Black people singled out in the media for negative things?
I think people of color and Black people especially, for some reason, there is an expectation that every individual Black person represents the community as a whole. There is more of a pressure for individual responsibility, and alongside the fact that a lot of bigoted or ignorant people see these people and don't see the human in the Black community, rather than recognizing that an individual can make mistakes and are sometimes driven to do things that are seen as bad. That isn't seen as a result of societal conditions or result of a lot of bad things that led to this bad decision. It's seen as like a part of them being inherently bad, period. So there's a lot of individual responsibility there.
I was gonna say, I think it kind of also goes back to just like kind of what we've all been talking about, like this unconscious like racial bias. I think it's done to like reinforce that, like definitely, like it's kind of when you see something in the media, it's like whenever they say like specifically a Black person, it's like it's not just a crime, it's a crime done by a Black person. So I think it just kind of goes back to that idea of like, well, I have like all these like unconscious or conscious racial biases. So when I see something done by the person who I have a racial bias, like I need to make sure I highlight that, even if unconsciously, to reinforce these racial biases.
Yeah, I also think there's incentive to keep portraying like Latinx people and people of color like as criminals, and to unconsciously associate them with with criminals, because there's people who benefit from racism. I mean, our whole government system benefits from racism, so there's not an incentive to start portraying people of color as humane.
I also think like the history of the media is important too. Like when in the throughout the 1800s and 1900s, when African Americans were being lynched on like a mass scale, like one of the common myths, probably the most prevalent myth, was like Black men as aggressors on like for like in toward white women, especially in like a sexual context. So like you would see the media report on like a lot of those stories, even if they weren't true, or like, and often they, most of the time they weren't true, but it was still kind of spread throughout the media. So I think like that history definitely has an influence on how like on our media like institutions today. And I think also another dynamic at play is like, even when we see white Americans commit crimes, it's like there's typically a reason for it, or we're given a reason. Like that case I mentioned earlier, the Adam Zaborowski case. He kind of, he shot at cops, injured a cop, and his attorney was reported in the media with saying that, and I'm quoting him directly here, he was just not handling the pandemic well. And they said that he lost his job and he lost a child, which are obviously like two traumatic experiences. But when we see African Americans or Latinx people commit crimes, they're not doing it because they're inherently evil or inherently bad people. There are also circumstances like when we see that people sold drugs or something, they typically can't find jobs, or the jobs that they find don't pay well. So that isn't typically highlighted as a reason why they committed their crime. It's just like this person of color committed a crime, and they're not given that kind of almost like a benefit of a doubt.
Right, and I think that we agree on how race is being depicted in the news. So I kind of want to jump a little bit over to how TV networks and Latin American channels depict race. The first question is, did you guys notice how the Black Lives Matter movement was shown in Univison and Telemundo?
My mom, she watches basically Univision, like that's like her Bible or something. And like I remember when we started talking about the Black Lives Matter, like the main thing she would say that the news would show was the protests and the violence, and like basically that, people started protesting for no reason, that they just wanted, they only used like George Floyd as an excuse to like basically let out their anger or violence.
I don't really watch Univision anymore like I used to, but I just happened to be watching the news one time with my mom like 2 months ago. And they had invited like 3 cops who were also Black. So they were Black Latinx people. and cops, and like they were being interviewed, and it just so happened that these three people were all very like pro-cop and anti-prison abolition. Univision seeks out people with certain mindsets that like they're looking for certain people who already agree with them, who already are down to push their reactionary conservative agenda, because that's what Univision is. It's very reactionary and conservative. And so they have these people on screen, like regular people like us, and so they want these people to share with the audience that no, cops are good and that we shouldn't abolish prisons. That's too extreme. And so they're feeding us that narrative.
Adriana, you just took us into our next question, which is, what does this say about Latinx culture?
That Latinx culture is very anti-Black. You know, we keep saying Black and Latinx as if they're two different things. We keep saying African American and Latinx people as if they're two different groups of people. I think we should be a little bit more specific about which Latinas we're talking about, and I say Latinas with an E at the end because that's easier to say. Like, are we talking about non-Black Latinas, indigenous Latinas, mestiz Latinas? Like, so we should also just like be mindful. Are we who are we talking about? Because every time we say Black and Latinx people, it sounds like we're talking about two different separate groups.
I was just gonna piggyback off of that, and I think probably just saying Latinas would suffice. I mean, it's incorporated within that. So
I think you're, Adriana, I think you're touching on like a really huge topic here, which is that like people still see Latinx as a race, but it's not, it's a nationality. And I think it also kind of goes to show that Latin America is like a whole thing on its own, because it also, like the US, has this like racial hierarchy. And I think that is reflected in its own media because it is anti-Black, it is anti-people with dark skin, which if you're Indígena, if you're Afro-Latino, like if you are even mestiz, like you're gonna have dark skin, you're gonna be portrayed with criminality. And if you're white, you're gonna be portrayed again as the norm. So I think it's kind of interesting that you bring that up, but they parallel each other so much. But yeah, over here in the US, like Latinx people are just associated with people of color, and there's like that lack of understanding of just how diverse like Latinx people actually are.
Yeah, I think this touches to like an issue. Like, I think it was yesterday with Joe Biden. Like, he said that, like, you know, Latinx culture was like very diverse, and like there's all these kinds of groups of people, unlike African Americans. And he caught a lot of heat with that, rightfully so. But yeah, I think Adriana, like that's a good point you bring up. Like, we tend to like just think of like it's like an umbrella term like Latinx, and like so many different you know, groups of people, Spanish speaking people and non-Spanish speaking people fall into that category. Whereas like we also look at like African Americans and we're just like, it's just like one homogenous group of people, when we know that's not true. So I think it's like, even the way we imagine these terms and like these identifications are, it's pretty, like even then there are like kind of stereotypes and like biases that we conjure up in our heads when we think about it and talk about it.
Do you think that Univision and Telemundo talk about a specific Black group that does not include Black Latinx? Like if Univision and Telemundo are excluding Black Latinx from the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, they always have. I mean, they do, like when they talk about like Afro-Americano, they're talking about like American Black people, but they're not talking about like Latin Black people at all. Like, you just don't see that a lot. Maybe now you see it here and there, but you don't really see coverage of their issues, of their lives, of their struggles. They portray African American, I'm saying this term because that's what they call them, the same way that the American media portrays them, you know, violent and crime and all this. They definitely don't touch upon the lives of the Black Latinx people.
So let's go even further. Let's talk about how these racial biases translate into telenovelas, which are really popular in Latin American families. How do the telenovelas and in Univision and Telemundo affect our idea of what a Latinx person looks like? And what kinds of roles are non-white Latinx people casted into?
In my experience, I usually see like darker skinned Latinx people in like telenovelas, like as like the maid, or as like the maid that is seen as like the grandmother, where like the beautiful light skinned girl can like have a shoulder to cry on. And it kind of, I feel like, has similarities to like the mammy stereotype that the US has like portrayed for older Black women. I see like that kind of parallel a lot. Um, just mostly as like side characters that like help the main characters like discover things about themselves, but they're never really given the main plot lines. They're never given really full, complex, dimensional personalities.
I was just going to say that also comes into play when you think about languages as well. Like there are, I don't know how to explain this in like the proper term, but like certain languages are like a little more tirado, like they're a little more rough, but the ones that you see are the more like ones credited that are like a little more like eloquent and like more flowy. Like you don't hear like Dominicans, you hear like beautiful, very, very flowery Mexican that are very, very white.
It's also like they portray like these beauty standards too, that like lighter skinned women are like more beautiful, like, you know, with the straight hair or like the blonde hair. Like they just keep like pushing this like narrative of like what beauty is, which is totally wrong and like obviously not right. But that's what like I grew up seeing, like just like what you needed to be to like have this like great life or whatever. Like, you had to be a certain way, you had to look a certain way.
I agree with what everybody's saying, and I think another like, what's the word, like another generalization that we kind of like consume is this idea that like all Latinx are Mexican. And I think that's mainly because most of like the novelas that are broadcasted, especially in the United States, are from Mexico, and they're all basically like people from Mexico. So I think by like only presenting like telenovelas or like having like Hispanic and / Latinx channels that are primarily Mexican, it also perpetuates like this idea that like, oh, like all Latinx people are Mexican. And yeah, I mean, aside from like also like the beauty standards that everybody touched upon.
Yeah, I agree with everyone as well. And just going back to what Gio said, I think like the language and like the accent is really important. Like it reminds me a lot of like even in like the US where we like people think, you know, people hear like like slang and they think it isn't like it makes it like they think it makes people sound like uneducated or it's like it doesn't make them sound sophisticated. And it's similar to like what happens with Telemundo and Univision. Like they have those people with like Gio was saying, like us like that kind of like sophisticated accent, and they don't let people on there like with any like slang that they or slang or accents that they consider to be like unsophisticated, and it just perpetuates like that similar stereotype that you see like in America, where like if you hear that kind of way of speaking, like you think these people aren't educated, so we can't possibly like listen to their views or like let them like speak their mind.
I think Geraldine touched upon something really important that I just noticed. So yeah, so like in DR, when they make like movies, like the Latin American cinema, whatever, like they actually hire Mexican actors to play the roles of like a lot of like Dominican like stories, which I think like I didn't really think about that until you spoke about it. And I think that's so like messed up. Like they didn't even get like their own people. Like they could, because a lot of like the novelas and stuff do come from Mexico, and like it's like this big like, well, this is how it should be in the language too, because like they should speak this way, they can't speak the Dominican slang or whatever, you know, they call how we speak Spanish. But that was a really important point.
Yeah, I just one last thing really quick. I went to Costa Rica like for study abroad during winter, and literally like the moment that I spoke in Spanish, like everybody they were like, "You're from Mexico, right?" Or like, "You're Mexican, right?" And I would be like, "Yeah," and I was like, how did you know?" And they're like, "Oh, because Mexicans like they talk so proper, like they talk so nice," and I was just like, "Oh, okay."
Right. So in this sense, are telenovelas leading non-white Latinx into believing that there's no other reality for them? This idea that you can't be what you can't see.
I would say so. Just speaking from experience, like this is going to sound really, really messed up, but like I would draw myself with like blue eyes and blonde hair and like use like the lightest crayon possible for like my skin because that's what you saw on TV. You know what I mean? Like there wasn't a whole lot of people of color on TV at all. And so when you see that, it really perpetuates like, oh, like that's beauty, but also that's what I should be. Like what I am now is not desired, and it sort of just shouldn't be at all in a way.
Speaking on that, I also have experience like not only the Latinx media, but like being in America, like I would see like I was obsessed with American Girl dolls, and I would look at the blonde American Girl dolls and I would be like, wow, like I don't look like that. Like why don't I look like that? Because like they're portrayed as so pretty and I don't look like that, so I must not be, you know, beautiful or pretty. And like I'm pretty light, like I'm pretty like white passing, but even so, like I was like not white enough for me. Like I was like I want to be blonde and blue-eyed. But now I kind of like looking back, I can see like, okay, that inner colonization was not it. But it was just such a trip, like to realize like, wow, at some point, like I just didn't want to be Latinx or have any type of brown blood in me at all.
Piggybacking off of what both of you said, I did the same exact thing that Gio did as a kid and drew myself like light skin, blonde eyes, or blonde hair, blue eyes. And the way that the media, even outside of telenovelas, just in American media and movies and TVs in general, the way that the hero is always portrayed to be white and skinny and blonde and blue eyes, like it very much narrows down what young people see as who you need to be successful and to make progress in the world. And then I'm not Latina, I'm Filipino, but growing up, like my only representation that I saw in movies for Asian folks was like the racist kid from the racist depiction in Breakfast at Tiffany's. Like I had so many friends whose favorite movie was that, and it was one of the most like racist depiction of an Asian person there could be in TV shows, just being like the smart person that everybody thinks is annoying. Like there was such a, it narrows the perspectives not only for everybody viewing, all of the white folks who are eventually going to spread those microaggressions, but also just like young kids who will be affected at the end of the day by what other people think of them and what they're being influenced by.
Yeah, and earlier we talked about what kinds of roles non-white Latinx people were casted into, and some examples were given, such as like the maid or the help, or they were seen as poor. So my next question is, why do non-white Latinx actors still choose to play these roles?
I think when it comes down to it, if those roles aren't taken, they're not filled at all. Like there's no representation at all. And so I think it was sort of seen as a stepping stone to realizing, oh, we can be like main characters rather than not be there at all.
I feel like if it's the norm and it's ingrained in you, you're not going to see it as offensive, and you're not going to see it as necessarily bad, or like you're diminishing yourself if you take those roles. I feel like, especially if you're an aspiring actor, you're not going to question like the role and its impact on people. You're going to want to do it because that's the only role available for you. And I think especially now, like even recently, like it hasn't been that recent where we've had representation and accurate representation and normalization of people of color, and now we're seeing like the rise of like the quirky brown girl or the quirky black girl, and that's like an attempt to like normalize, but it's very recent and it's not something the ingrained racism is very, very old, and yeah, there weren't a lot of roles. There's like still not a lot of roles for actors.
I think also whitewashing is very real. So if non-white Latinx and people of color that are actors in general don't take the roles, then many directors are completely comfortable just casting a white person in their spot. So it's almost like a choice of, do I want to continue representing this stereotype that's working against me, or do I want to let a white person don our identity as a costume and do it for us? And neither are good in any way, but it's like one pays the bills, which is the unfortunate truth for a lot of non-white actors.
I think along with all of this, I think part of like why that kind of those like side roles that are like full of like stereotypes kind of exist though is because a lot of what we've been saying, like the ingrained racism and like the ingrained stereotypes, but also like, you know, I think show producers and like TV producers just think like this is the way it has to be, like it's the way it's always been done. So we have to like, if we want to be successful in what we do, we need to like replicate the model. But we've been seeing like increasingly a lot of there are examples of like people who don't recreate that model, and I don't want to say they're perfect. Things like examples that come to mind are like Hamilton, Black Panther. Those aren't obviously like, I'm not saying those two examples are like have no bias, like no stereotypes in them, but we see that like they integrate like black and black and brown actors into like leading roles on a pretty like wide scale, and they've been wildly successful. Black Panther like did really well at the box office. I mean, Hamilton is like probably, I'd say the most successful musical on Broadway. So it's interesting because like these producers are seeing like, well, you can obviously be successful if you like go outside of the box, but they still won't do it. So it's like, I feel like they can no longer use that argument. Like when they decide to like not include lead acting roles for people of color, like they're really, they can't just say like, well, we need to do it to be successful. Like that's not the case anymore.
I would like to build off of what Berta said as well, in terms of backlash. Like I know they made the leading actress for The Little Mermaid Black, and there was a lot of backlash. And so when they're thinking of who's buying their stuff, who has access to their films, even though I'm pretty sure Latinas represent like 25% of the like theater market, they still seem to somehow not cater to them. And that their business is not good enough. Our business is not good enough.
I think just one last thing about like theater business as it relates to people of color and Latinx folks, like taking those stereotypical roles and even taking very accurately represented roles still yield really awful consequences for people of color in the theater industry. Alongside the Black woman who was cast as the Little Mermaid, who received so much hate mail and was almost held solely responsible by folks for forced diversity on Broadway. Another great example would be, if anyone's familiar with the Star Wars franchise, an Asian woman was cast as one of the lead roles in, I think, the second newest movie. And she received so many death threats and hate mail, and was just overall hated so much by the white people consuming this media that they pretty much took out her character entirely in the last installation. So she only had like 2 lines of dialogue when she literally was like part of half the movie previously. So no matter what, there is a loss in being a person of color on television or in storytelling in general.
We have seen that the news and television networks don't accurately represent the Asian, Black, and Latinx communities. So I want to switch over to music a little bit. Does music continue or disrupt this pattern?
Definitely continues it. For example, Bad Bunny, white, cishet, Latinx man, who became super famous off of reggaeton and Latin trap. Reggaeton, as we know, has Black origins, but he's the face of it, right? He's like, everyone knows who he is, and everyone associates his face with that genre. So, yeah, like, non-Black people dominate in music, and like even in non-Latin music genres, it's gonna be non-Black people who like reach the spotlight almost immediately, or they just like gain a lot of attention.
I do think that it's better than the other spheres. I mean, like, I think, you know, when you're thinking about like music coming out of the Dominican Republic, like I think El Alfa, who's darker, but again he's cis. So I think that's that part is still really dominated by like I think heterosexual men. But I do think like in terms of like race, like, I think El Alfa, I think even like some of like the bachata artists I think are like darker in skin color. But I do think that like the face is typically, like, Bad Bunny is a face of reggaeton. I mean, he's like, I walk into like just like your everyday like bar and like you'll hear Bad Bunny. Like you'll hear white people listening to him too. So like I think he does dominate as like a white like Puerto Rican. But I do think that it's a little like you still get it. It's still, there's better representation than in the media and in TV. Like even Sech has become really popular. And I mean, I grew up listening to like Tego Calderon, Don Omar. So it's, you know, like the big afro. My little brother, I remember, had like a huge afro with a pick in it. They call him Tego Calderon because he looked like him. So like I think some of those like earlier images and like even like some of the other artists that might not be as popular but still pretty popular have better representation than like other forms of media. But I would agree that it is dominated by kind of like that white image. And I think even when you think about like like when you start advertising it to like other groups of people, because I think reggaeton used to be like pretty like insular, like Latinx people listen to it, but not really like outside of that. Now it's becoming more like worldwide, and I think they're selling it with the face of like lighter white skinned people.
I was going to agree with that. Yes, like even when it comes to people of color rather than people who are a little more like Eurocentric featured, it's still not enough. Like it's still like whitewashed. Like it's still the lighter skins are the more, how would you say, affluent, the ones who make it out.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at like the Super Bowl. Like, yes, they had like Latinx people. They had Shakira, they had J Lo, Bad Bunny, but like, where were the like, you know, Black Latinx at? Or like, you know, like they didn't have any of that. And even when you see on like, you saw, yes, some people here and there, but like, you're not really gonna see like artists performing that are like Black Latinx.
And to build off of that as well, like the level of solidarity between Afro-Latinos and African Americans, well, they're still similar, but there's overlap. But like the whole point of people not taking that show was to go against all of that. You know what I mean? Like, and they took it. So like, where does that put them now? You feel?
And just to go back to the sexuality piece too, like I know Bad Bunny like released that one song Yo Perreo Sola, where he like cross dressed, and he got like so much hate for it in like the mainstream media. And even like I know like people, like older people in my family, were saying like the most problematic things about it. And I'm like, you know, like I the song, I really like the song, and like I thought like it was again not a perfect attempt at like but I think it was like better than what a lot of other people do. And like he just received a lot of backlash, even from like some of the other like mainstream like reggaeton artists. So it just shows like even when those like more acceptable like white passing artists try to like bring up certain issues, like they're shut down usually.
Berta, why do you think they're shut down, or in general to anyone?
I mean, the patriarchal like thing in Latin America. Like, of course, they're gonna shut down somebody that's trying to like bring awareness to something like that. Is that's another big, that's a whole other conversation that would take hours, but that's a big problem too in Latin America that we all are aware of. We all probably have gone through it, even in other cultures as well, not just Latin America, worldwide, the patriarchy.
I think it's also really interesting, like while the mainstream media was bashing on Bad Bunny for that, I know my Twitter was blowing up with like girls saying like, oh my god, he's so hot, like even when he dresses like a girl. Like girls still like were into him. And like I thought it was interesting, and a lot, like I see so much like analysis on Twitter, but like I thought it was interesting, and there was this one tweet that was like it just goes to show that a lot of like internalized misogyny and like what a man should be, and like what a man is portrayed as, like often isn't really true, and like the constructs of racism and the patriarchy, I feel like overlap a lot.
And it also brought his sexuality into question. Like the fact that he cross-dressed was like, well, he can't be heterosexual. But like it's like that idea, like I think that's another like really prevalent like thing in like the machismo and like Latinx culture. Like, you know, like if he dressed like that, like he has to be homosexual. So I don't, which again, like that's not, they don't have to be like completely separate things. But that's the way that the culture perceives it. So I thought that was like another interesting dynamic. I saw a lot of like news reporters, like a few of them that did interviews with him, like shortly after that, they were all asking him like, what is your like sexual preference? What's your sexuality? And he was like, I think he answered well. And he kind of said like, I, you know, he tried to like steer away from like, it's not about that. It's like, you know, I can like who I like. But how I perform and like my artistic like choices and how I dress doesn't need to be connected to that. So I thought that was just another interesting thing, that like a part of the backlash was like, well, he can't possibly be heterosexual, and that didn't make sense to me. But I understand like why it is, and like I know it stems from that like machismo part of the culture.
I think that that's a really good discussion, and it prompts me to ask, how can people who don't identify as, let's say, Black or gay, etc., bring awareness without insulting these social groups?
Trying to limit othering, I think. I think like we said prior to this, like we make it sort of the title of that person or the group or the activity, rather than just another sort of activity for people that we love. And I'm not trying to say like, I don't see race, you know what I mean? Like that's totally counterproductive. But with that token, still try not to other. And I don't know, can someone help me out with that one? I'm trying to further develop that.
Speaking as a queer person, I think a lot of the time it's like what Gio was kind of saying with the need to other people in order to understand them. A lot of the time, especially our generation, loves to glorify drag queens and the typical like cis gay man best friend who paints their nails and dresses femininely. But the second that a trans man or a straight man starts dressing femininely, there's something to be had about that. It's almost as if they're not allowed to express themselves in the way they want without exiting the realm of what other people perceive their community to be. I think specifically for the queer community, it's a matter of separating the idea of sexuality and gender from just like self-expression. And it goes all the way back to just the patriarchy and just like cis heteronormativity, in that there is an impulse to other people in general that dress femininely or act out of whatever gender they were assigned at birth. But at the same time, and this can be tied back into the conversation of people of color and Black people specifically, like there are certain mannerisms or traditions that are inherently cultural, and that were created by these communities and can still be respected as part of their identity. So I think it's a lot more complex than people kind of perceive it to be at first, but understanding the difference between like what is important to their culture and what truly belongs to them versus like what choice they make to express themselves, or the personality traits that they adhere to. They're two very separate things.
I was gonna say, like, one of the ways I think that like a lot of people can bring awareness is by like amplifying the voices of said community. One of the things that like I'm not trying to like self-promote over here my Instagram, but like one of the things that I posted on my Instagram was saying how like whenever Black Lives Matter movement started, I wasn't really, not that I was like ignorant to the fact of like whether I was amplifying like Black voices or like any other voices, but at times I would use like the voices of people who aren't Black identifying to like bring awareness to the issue. And while like that's great because you're bringing awareness, I think it's important to recognize that if you really care about like Black liberation, then you have to listen to Black people. And I think that in trying to like put in your own input, or like just like everybody wants to get a say, then for example, like in the Black Lives Matter movement, like a lot of people like had input and wanted to say like how they felt about it. And I think it's kind of counterproductive because you end up taking away from like the voices that you should be listening to. So I think like instead of feeling this need of like bringing in your own voice, just like amplify the voices that are already like need volume.
Geraldine, I think you bring up a great point. We're talking a lot about how artists can bring awareness properly, and there's a lot of awareness being created through social media. So can I get some short answers on what performative activism / slacktivism is?
Pushing a black square. I think when it comes to mind, for me at least, the black square was definitely a big one. Sort of just doing as little as possible, but sort of just showing face so that you're not culpable of any of the consequences of not being there or not showing up.
Right. So the definition that we'll go by for the purposes of this panel is activism done to increase one's social capital rather than because of one's devotion to a cause. It is often associated with surface level activism referred to as slacktivism. Can we give some more examples?
So I was going to say, like, I feel like a lot of, like, on pretty much everyone's story is like sharing like resources or like posting about like what your opinions are. And I'm not saying like anyone is guilty of like slacktivism, but more or less like everyone is like, or at least everyone on my like feed is doing it. I feel like it's almost impossible to tell like who is a slacktivist is, because literally everyone is posting about these issues. And on one hand, I'm like, okay, it's great that like everyone is passionate and everyone really wants like change in our society. But at the same time, it is like, what are we doing that like will really have an impact besides just sharing something on social media? And I think that's like the hardest thing to track. So like while slacktivism, like I think we're aware of it, but it's also unclear how to like pick it out and how to combat that.
A way that I have talked with people in distinguishing between whether your activism is performative or productive when it comes to sharing on social media is, are you sharing resources that people can then educate themselves with, or sharing like books or recommendations or statistics that can influence people to do their own research, versus I think the most popular form of performative activism I've seen is just sharing like a news headline, or like, and this could like launch a whole different conversation, but like memes that were created out of the death of Breonna Taylor that are like, pick like your zodiac sign, read your horoscope, and then it just says like arrest the cops that murdered Breonna Taylor, which is like creating like sensationalizing a Black woman's death, which is a whole nother concept. But it's like these posts that get shared, And then you look at it and like these people just say like, oh my God, this is so horrible. Or, oh my God, like I can't believe this is still happening. And it's like, okay, what do we do with it now? It's a matter of like giving people actionable steps with the things that you're showing instead of just being like, look at me, I'm really mad that this is happening, because like that's valid, but like we all are, and we just want to know what to do about it.
You know what got me so mad? During the protests and stuff, like people will go to the protest just to pose with the little banner and then like leave. Like, what? Like that's right there, like a good example of what not to do, y'all.
Speaking on that, I remember like Madison Beer, who's like this really big influencer. I think she sings, but people mostly know her for like being pretty. But like basically she got so under fire for like pretty much going to Black Lives Matter movement and then just getting her picture taken like the pretty much the whole time. And like people were like, that was obviously like planned, because like the photographer was on you the whole time, and like you guys obviously knew each other. And like the way she went about it, like she barely apologized. She didn't really apologize for it. And I think that's kind of also another thing about like celebrities who have the privilege don't realize like how much their activism is performative.
I think another thing about social media is that I think it's become the platform for activism. Like, I mean, definitely, I think you see in like the 1900s that people are out in the streets protesting, and not that isn't happening now, because obviously it is. There have been so many like Black Lives Matter movements and like even like gay pride parades, but like social media has really become like the platform, and I think there are a lot of benefits to it. Like it's instantaneous, so you can kind of like, if something's happening, you can like send the info out like in real time. Even when we see like police attacking people of color, like we can see that happening, like spread the info. But I think one of the negatives is that performative part comes into it. And I think the reason why it does, or one of the reasons I think it does, is because there are a lot of there's a lot of younger, like more liberal people have like it's like social media is like a bubble. So like you don't, I mean personally, like I usually have people on my social media like have the same interests as me and like same, like not completely same opinions, but like I, have kind of the same even political beliefs. So if you identify that way, like you're gonna see everyone on your social media doing it. So it's almost like, and if you're someone like Madison, who was mentioned earlier, like you're going to want to like put out posts to make sure that you're like relevant and like continue your like your popularity. And like when there's like a movement going on like that, you want to be a part, you want to seem like you're being a part of it to continue and like expand your popularity. But that's really like you said earlier, Madi said, like it's just about increasing the social capital. So I think that's really like, that's become like one of the most obvious downsides to activism on social media. But I think it's these kinds of like topics about like what's hurtful and what's beneficial is going to become a lot more important in like as we move forward, because I think like whether we like it or not, so like a lot of activism is going to happen on social media.
Right, so let's switch it up a little bit to talk about political correctness. The definition that we'll be using is the avoidance, often considered as taken to extremes, of forms of expression or action that are perceived to exclude, marginalize, or insult groups of people who are socially disadvantaged or discriminated against. So, is political correctness toxic or beneficial?
I think from the jump, you can just say that it's beneficial. Greater systems that function for the marginalized are how society evolves, with inclusion at the margins. Like that's pretty much how we continue to upgrade our lives and include, how would you say, more functions into our society that benefit not only just the, I don't want to say regular, but like the people who like the white people who deem themselves as regular, the white cis, like, you know what I mean? Like these are things that they don't have to worry about. And so when you take that into account and you include the marginalized, like that's when we're just better people, we're a better community, we have stronger systems like.
I think it depends all on the delivery, because at the end of the day, political correctness, you have to communicate, and you have to be able to communicate like why someone said something offensive or why someone said something outdated. Because I feel like I have seen both examples where like someone says something and it completely like shuts the other person down to the point where they're not open to the other point of view. But I've also seen it as like saying it in a way that like doesn't like make the person feel like, then it also kind of goes into this thing of like white guilt and like white fragility. It's just like a whole like tricky thing, just because like no one wants to feel like they're the bad guy, but like it's about having difficult conversations.
Yeah, I think jumping off of that point, like having these difficult conversations, it's really hard because like marginalized community members, like their struggle and their frustration is very real when having to defend themselves and like explain why something was so hurtful to them and their families. But I think especially for allies going into these conversations with folks who use offensive language, you have to go in with the intention of educating and not arguing. Because oftentimes it feels like in engaging in these conversations, especially online, it's like you're trying to prove that you're right and you're like more morally like upright than the other person, when in reality, like to better this situation for everyone, you just want to pass on the information rather than like beat them over the head with it. But that isn't to say that like any like lashing out or upset that has been caused because of the frustration that marginalized communities are experiencing isn't any less like valid or like understandable.
In that same frame of mind, should people that are not being politically correct be canceled as a part of cancel culture?
I have a complicated opinion on this because I personally hate cancel culture. I think that certain people, like sexual offenders, and there are many crimes and actions that are completely irreconcilable, and there's no way for that person to take that trauma back or make up for it. But in the context of people using offensive language or speaking out of line for a different community, or any mistake that can be easily corrected by educating them and having them look into the research themselves and start being an activist themselves, I think that is more productive than just like shutting somebody's platform down. Because at the end of the day, like you can cancel a person who you can educate instead, but they're still gonna have their platform to spread that hate. So like the way I see it, like why not try to educate them first, you know?
So yeah, I really agree with that. Like I think I actually had a conversation about this with someone the other day, and the word they used was like accountability culture instead. And it's just like exactly like it's that same idea, like just to make sure that we're not necessarily completely alienating and cutting off, but saying like, you know, there was a mess up here, and like this is how you can correct it. And like I think, you know, if someone doesn't show the willingness to like make that correction or like to really like own up to like a mistake, then I think that's, you know, like maybe that's where cancel culture needs to come in. But I think more often than not, if you give them like the opportunity, like the openness and like the space to feel comfortable saying like, yes, I did mess up, and like I'm going to do what I need to like and like, you know, do the like complete the education and like use the appropriate term, and like I feel sorry about what I did. I think that's like, I respect that a lot, and I think it helps to move the conversation forward a lot more than just simply canceling them. But also I think I do think there are some parts of cancel culture that are like good too, like not necessarily good, but I think give people a voice, like the even like the early stages of the Me Too movement, like when women were sharing their stories on social media, like I think that's very powerful. So yeah, I really agree with what was said earlier, and I think there should be a shift to like accountability culture.
I was just kind of wanted to piggyback off of what everybody was saying. I think like I definitely like don't agree with cancel culture, but I do understand like people's like sometimes like they feel like they have to do it. I think cancel culture like quickly turns into just like eliminating anybody that doesn't agree with you. And my kind of perspective on cancel culture is like I think it's it's like a good thing depending on like what your end goal is. Like if your end goal is just to like just like kind of shut out anybody that you disagree with, then like cancel culture is definitely like the route to go, because you know you're just like canceling them. But I think if your goal is to bring about like sustainable change and like change the culture, then I don't think that cancel culture is the way to go, you know. And kind of like referring back to what someone said earlier, you can like cancel someone, but that doesn't mean that all of a sudden they're put in a box and they can't spread any of their ideas. Like it's still going to be passed on.
Yeah, just kind of what everyone else was saying. I think it feeds too much into like a hive mind mentality. I'm all for keeping people accountable. I like the accountability culture versus like cancel culture, because when you cancel someone, you're pretty much like shutting them down without like opening the space and opening up things for conversation and saying like why it's messed up or like why it's wrong or why it's offensive. I think like a good prime example is like Doja Cat. And like she recently was like under fire for like being self-hating and like being racist. But I feel like in hearing all of our stories, like that's all something we went through, which is like not liking yourself because of like the way like you're portrayed in the media, or like the like having that inner conflict with yourself. And I'm like, well, instead of like hating her and canceling her, like why don't we encourage this girl to get help or therapy or something, instead of like immediately shutting down? Like isn't that what we want? Is less separation and more community.
In thinking about everything that we've discussed today, how can we be critical of what we see and hear? How can we construct a different idea of Black, Latinx, etc. within ourselves when we are surrounded by the different perceptions and biases in the media?
I think that once you start like educating yourself more, you start being aware of it a lot more. Like now I watch like shows and I see different things that I probably before I was like this educated, wouldn't probably have seen. And when it comes to that, then you have to like notice it, and then you also have to correct other people that might not see what you see. So like if it's a family member or anything like that, like try to like teach them as well, and try to like make them understand why it is that it's wrong the way it's depicted. And that's how we move forward, because like it does work, because it definitely worked in my family. That takes time, but they start seeing it too, and then it becomes like a chain, and then like you know so yeah, for me that's what I would do.
I think there's part, again, incorporating that accountability culture into being critical. Try to read, try to take in as many resources, and try your best not to put the brunt of it on people who are suffering and people who are othered. I think in doing so, it sort of lessens their responsibilities as well, because when you have Afro-Latinos and other, I guess, like queer peoples, and you're asking them for hints and how do I navigate this path or this conversation, it puts a lot more pressure on them, and it adds to the work they have to do as well.
Yeah, I think too, thinking critically and also exposing yourself to diverse platforms and to like maybe YouTubers of color. And I think that's also why representation is so important, because when you see people that look like you or people that look like your friends, people that are like platforms and media that are more diverse, then it does start to become the norm. So I think we are seeing like a rise of more diversity in the media, and hopefully that'll get stronger as we progress.
I think for me, one of the biggest things that like I've been trying to do is like put a bigger gap between like listening and you know like accepting and internalizing, and like kind of like the bridge between that gap is like, you know, self-education and questioning and like all those good stuff. Because I think that a lot of the time you know, especially with the media, you see, you listen things, and it quickly becomes like acceptance and internalizing. So I think, you know, like I think putting gaps sometimes is seen as a bad thing, but I think when it comes to like the things that we accept and we internalize, we have to like put a bigger gap between those two things.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and give a special thank you to each of our panelists for sharing their own personal experiences as well as thoughts to each of these questions. This recording is going to be accessible via Tumbao's YouTube channel, tumbao.lu, and Instagram. And tune in next week for the next topic, which will be now and after in the Black Lives Matter movement. So thank you all for joining.
Bye, guys.